The last thing I remembered was the cold. It wasn't the clean, crisp cold of a winter morning in the Hamptons. It was a damp, biting chill that seeped into my bones from the concrete floor of the basement. I remembered the hunger, a hollow, gnawing beast that had eventually stopped screaming and settled into a dull, heavy ache. I remembered Preston's shoes, polished, expensive Italian leather, appearing at the top of the stairs once a day. "You did this to yourself, Aria," he had said, his voice as smooth and cold as marble. "You were meant to be my masterpiece. You ruined the lines. You ruined the image. Now you're just waste." Then, the world had faded into a merciful gray. I gasped, my lungs burning as if they had forgotten how to draw air. I wasn't on concrete. I was lying on high-thread count Egyptian cotton. The air smelled of expensive candles and fresh lilies. I sat up, my hand flying to my stomach. It was flat. My rib cage was no longer a skeletal cage visible through translucent skin. I scrambled out of bed and ran to the vanity. My face was full, my hair glossy. I looked like the socialite of the year again. Then I saw it. On the marble counter sat a small white stick. 2 pink lines. August 12th. In my past life, this was the day I had excitedly told Preston we were starting a family. I had thought he would be overjoyed. Instead, that news had been my death warrant. He didn't want a child. He wanted a porcelain doll that never changed. "Aria? Are you in there?" Preston's voice called from the bedroom. I froze. The sound of his voice made my skin crawl. I looked at the test. In 10 minutes, he would walk in here. In 10 minutes, the cycle of control would begin. I grabbed the test and shoved it deep into the velvet-lined jewelry box on the counter. "I'm here, Preston," I said, my voice trembling. "I'm just getting ready for the day." "Hurry up," he said. "We have the gallery opening tonight. I want you in the vintage Chanel. You need to look perfect." Perfect, I thought, staring at my reflection. The last time I was perfect, you let me starve. This time, the only image I was going to protect was the one growing inside me. The dining room of our Fifth Avenue penthouse was a masterpiece of cold, hard surfaces, veined Carrara marble, floor-to-ceiling glass, and a 20-foot mahogany table that felt more like a barrier than a piece of furniture. It was a room designed for Architectural Digest, not for a home. Preston sat at the head of the table, looking impeccably groomed in a bespoke charcoal suit that probably cost more than most people's cars. He didn't look like a man who would eventually lock his wife in a basement. He looked like a prince. But I knew better now. I saw the predator behind the polish. "You look peaky this morning, Aria," Preston said, not looking up from his tablet. He swiped through a series of market reports with a surgical precision. "There's a slight puffiness around your jawline. Are you retaining water? I told you to cut back on the sodium before the gallery opening." I gripped my silver fork until the ornate pattern dug into my palm. In my past life, I would have apologized profusely, promised to drink more lemon water, and spent an hour on the treadmill to atone for the crime of being human. Now, I just felt a cold, simmering fury. "I'm just tired, Preston," I said, my voice sounding hollow in the cavernous room. "I didn't sleep well." "Sleep is no excuse for a lack of discipline," he said, finally lifting his gaze. His eyes were a piercing, icy blue, the kind of blue that made you feel like a specimen under a microscope. "Our image is our currency. If you look exhausted, people think I'm failing. And I do not fail, Aria. Ever." I pushed a piece of dry, unbuttered toast around my gold-rimmed plate. The smell of his black espresso made my stomach do a violent somersault. The morning sickness was starting to hit, a wave of nausea that threatened to shatter my mask. I took a slow, measured breath, praying I wouldn't heave right there on the Persian rug. "I've booked you a 3 o'clock session at the clinic," Preston continued, returning his attention to his tablet. "A lymphatic drainage massage and a vitamin drip. And for heaven's sake, don't eat lunch. The vintage Chanel I've picked out for tonight is unforgiving. It highlights the waist. I want you to look like a statue, not a woman." "A statue," I whispered, the words tasting like ash. "Is that what you want, Preston? Something that doesn't breathe? Something that doesn't change?" He paused, his eyes narrowing slightly. For a second, a flicker of genuine irritation crossed his face, the first crack in his perfect facade. I want excellence, Aria. I married you because you were the most beautiful woman in this city. I expect you to maintain the investment. Is that too much to ask? No, Preston, I said, forcing a faint, practiced smile. It's not too much to ask. I watched him finish his espresso, every movement calculated and graceful. He was a man who lived for the surface of things. In my past life, when my pregnancy had begun to soften the sharp lines of my body, he hadn't seen a miracle. He had seen a devaluation of assets. The diet plans had started as suggestions, then became commands, and eventually, they became the lock on the basement door. Good, he said, standing up and adjusting his cufflinks. He walked over and pressed a perfunctory, cold kiss to my forehead. He didn't smell like a husband. He smelled of expensive cologne and a chilling lack of empathy. I'll see you at 7. Where the emeralds? They distract from the eyes if you're still looking tired. The second the elevator doors hissed shut behind him, I dropped the toast and ran for the bathroom. I fell to my knees, the porcelain cold against my skin, and let the nausea take over. As I sat there, shaking and gasping for air, I realized I was in a race against time. My body was already changing, growing a life that Preston would view as a defect. I stood up, wiped my mouth, and splashed cold water on my face. I didn't head to the esthetician. I grabbed a plain trench coat to hide my designer clothes and slipped out the back service entrance. I needed to find the one man who had tried to save me when I was nothing but bones and shadows. I needed Silas. The clinic was a jarring slap of reality. Located in a neighborhood of weathered brick and cracked sidewalks, it was worlds away from the polished glass towers of Midtown. Inside, the air didn't smell like sandalwood or expensive lilies. It smelled of industrial-grade disinfectant, old coffee, and the weary, human scent of a crowded waiting room. I sat on a plastic chair that creaked under my weight, clutching my trench coat closed as if it were a suit of armor. I felt like a fluorescent bird in a cage of sparrows, my designer shoes tucked nervously under the seat. Aria Montgomery? A nurse called out, her voice flat and tired. I stood up, my heart performing a frantic tap dance against my ribs. I followed her down a narrow hallway to a small examination room. It was cramped, lit by flickering fluorescent tubes that made my skin look as pale as parchment in the mirror. I sat on the edge of the exam table, the crinkle of the sanitary paper sounding like a thunderclap in the silence. The door opened a moment later. Silas stepped in, and for a second, I forgot how to breathe. He looked younger than he had in the basement. The deep lines of sorrow and the exhaustion that had etched his face while he watched me slip away were gone. He wore a simple white lab coat over a blue button-down, a stethoscope draped around a neck that looked strong enough to carry the world. But his eyes, those dark, intelligent, and piercingly kind eyes, were exactly the same. He was the only person who had ever looked at me and seen a human being instead of a mannequin. He stopped in his tracks, his gaze sweeping over my silk dress and the emerald studs in my ears. He checked his clipboard, then looked back at me, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Mrs. Montgomery?" he asked, his voice a rich, steady baritone. "My nurse said the name on the intake form was yours, but I assumed it was a mistake. You're a long way from Park Avenue. Is your family physician out of town?" "I don't want my family physician, Dr. Thorne," I said, my voice trembling. I forced myself to look directly at him, to show him the raw terror I was usually so good at hiding. "And I don't want anyone who knows my husband." Silas set the clipboard down on the small metal counter. He leaned back against the sink, crossing his arms. He didn't look impressed by my name or my status. He looked wary. "Most women in your position prefer the gold-plated service of the Upper East Side. Why come to a public clinic? Why me?" "Because you're the only doctor in this city who doesn't play golf with Preston," I said. "And because I think you're the only one who might actually tell me the truth." He watched me for a long beat, his clinical detachment wavering as he took in the way I was shaking. "The truth about what, Aria?" "I'm pregnant," I whispered. The words felt like a confession of a crime. Silas didn't offer a hollow congratulations. He didn't smile. He saw the way I flinched at the word. I see. And I take it this isn't the happy news the society columns are waiting for. If my husband finds out, he'll try to control every bite I eat, every move I make, and every pound I gain, I said, the words spilling out of me like a broken dam. He cares about the image of his wife more than her life. I need help, Silas. I need to protect this baby, but I have to make Preston believe it's gone. If he thinks I'm carrying his heir, he'll never let me out of his sight. He'll lock me away. Silas walked toward me, his expression softening into something intensely protective. He reached out as if to touch my shoulder, then paused, giving me space. That's a very serious accusation, Mrs. Montgomery. Preston Montgomery is a pillar of this community. Pillars are cold, Silas, I said, a tear finally escaping and tracking through my expensive foundation. And they can crush you if you're trapped underneath them. Please, help me fake a miscarriage. Help me save my child from him. Silas looked into my eyes, and I saw the moment his skepticism died. He didn't know about the basement yet, not in this life, but he saw the ghost of the woman I had become. I won't let him hurt you, Silas said, his voice a low, solemn vow. If what you're saying is true, we have a lot of work to do. But you're safe here. I've got you. The night of the Founders Gala arrived like a funeral shroud draped in sequins. Preston stood behind me in our dressing room, his eyes fixed on the mirror as he adjusted his silk bow tie. He didn't look at my face. He looked at the silhouette of the vintage Chanel gown. It was a shimmering, silver sheath that clung to every curve, cinched so tightly at the waist that I could only take shallow, panicked breaths. I knew that liquid fast would pay off, Aria, Preston said, his voice humming with a terrifying kind of satisfaction. Look at that line. Not a single imperfection. You look like you're made of moonlight and steel. Don't ruin it by slouching. I won't, Preston, I said, my voice barely a whisper. In my clutch, nestled against a lace handkerchief, was the small glass vial Silas had given me. It felt heavy, a cold weight of truth in a room full of lies. Silas had explained that the synthetic fluid would induce localized cramping and a controlled fever, enough to mimic the onset of a miscarriage, without actually endangering the tiny life growing inside me. It was a gamble, a desperate play to reclaim my body by pretending to lose the very thing that made it imperfect in Preston's eyes. Drink your water, Preston said, handing me a crystal glass. It'll keep your skin from looking dull under the ballroom lights. And remember, no appetizers. I want that stomach flat until the final toast. I remember, I said. We arrived at the Pierre Hotel in a flurry of camera flashes. The ballroom was a dizzying sea of black ties, diamonds, and the cloying scent of expensive lilies. I played my part to perfection. I smiled at the right donors, laughed at the dry jokes of board members, and stood perfectly still while Preston showed me off like a prize filly. Around 10 p.m., I slipped into the ladies' lounge. With shaking hands, I opened the vial and swallowed the bitter liquid. I leaned against the marble vanity, counting the seconds. Within 10 minutes, a dull, thrumming ache began in my lower abdomen. It sharpened quickly, blooming into a jagged heat that made my vision swim. This was it. I walked back into the ballroom, my face pale and slick with a fine sheen of sweat. I found Preston near the center of the room, surrounded by a group of city council members. Preston, I gasped, reaching out to catch his arm. A sharp, rhythmic contraction seized me, and I felt the staged fluid, a warm, dark liquid, begin to stain the silver silk of the Chanel. Aria, what on earth? Preston said, his eyes dropping to the darkening stain on my skirt. His first reaction wasn't to catch me, it was to recoil. His face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated disgust. You're making a scene. What is that mess? I think I'm losing it, Preston. I cried out, the pain becoming real enough to make my knees buckle. Help me. The baby. My God, Aria, he whispered, his voice vibrating with embarrassment rather than concern. He looked around frantically, making sure no one was filming. Get her out of here. Discreetly. I won't have the Montgomery name associated with a public medical emergency. He signaled for his security team, who moved in like a cleanup crew. They didn't lift me with tenderness. They bundled me toward the service exit like a damaged piece of furniture. As they shoved me into the back of a waiting car, the door opened from the other side. Silas was there, dressed in a dark suit, his face a grim mask of professional urgency. He had been waiting in the shadows of the valet line, just as we'd planned. "I'm the on-call physician for the event," Silas said to the security guards, flashing his credentials with a cold authority. "I'll take her to the hospital. You tell Mr. Montgomery she's in my care." The guards hesitated, then retreated as Preston waved them off from the hotel steps, already turning back to his guests to spin a lie about a sudden, dizzy spell. Silas climbed into the car and pulled me into his arms. The cold air hit my face, and the feverish heat began to recede. "I've got you, Aria," Silas said, his voice a low, fierce promise against my ear. "The performance is over. You're safe." He looked at me like I was garbage, Silas. I sobbed into his shoulder. He didn't even care about the baby. He only cared about the dress. "I know," Silas said, his grip tightening. "But from tonight on, he'll never see the truth again. We're going to make sure of that." The days following the gala were a masterclass in chilling indifference. Preston treated the loss of our child as one might treat a smudge on a window, an annoying imperfection that had been successfully buffed away. He bought me a necklace of yellow diamonds, the stones cold and heavy against my skin, as a get-well gift. It wasn't a gesture of love. It was a reward for returning to the status quo. "You look much better already, Aria," Preston said, leaning against the doorframe of my bedroom a week later. He watched as I stepped onto the scale, his eyes tracking the digital numbers with the intensity of a day trader. "The bloating has subsided. I've rescheduled your fitness assessments for Monday. We have the symphony benefit in 3 weeks, and I want that silver gown to fit even better than it did before." "I'm still a bit weak, Preston," I said, my voice carefully modulated to sound fragile. "Dr. Thorne said I need a few weeks of bed rest and a high-protein diet to recover from the blood loss." Preston scoffed, checking his gold watch. "Thorne is a public clinic alarmist. He doesn't understand the demands of our social calendar. But fine, take your rest. Just don't let yourself get soft. I've instructed the chef to keep your caloric intake at 1200. We wouldn't want all that rest to go to your hips." "Of course, Preston," I whispered. The second he left for the office, the mask shattered. I didn't go back to bed. I went to the library. Under the guise of organizing the family archives during my recovery, I began to dig. I knew Preston had secret accounts. I remembered the whispered phone calls from my past life, the mentions of maintenance fees for private facilities. I found a hidden compartment in his mahogany desk, a simple spring-loaded latch I remembered him using once when he thought I was asleep. Inside was a ledger that made my blood run cold. It wasn't just me. There were names of 3 other women, dated over the last 15 years. All of them had been admitted to private sanitariums for rest and restoration. All of them had disappeared from the social register shortly after. I took photos of every page with the burner phone Silas had provided. My hands shook so violently I had to lean against the desk to steady myself. I wasn't just fighting for my life. I was fighting the ghost of a monster who had been doing this for a long time. That afternoon, I met Silas at his clinic under the pretense of a follow-up exam. The moment the door to the examination room closed, Silas was there, his hands steadying me. "You're trembling, Aria," Silas said, his brow furrowed with concern. "What happened? Did he suspect something?" "No," I said, handing him the burner phone. "He's too busy counting my calories to notice I'm stealing his secrets." "Silas, I'm not the first. There are others. He has a system for disposing of women who no longer fit his image." Silas looked through the photos, his jaw tightening until a muscle leaped in his cheek. "This is more than domestic abuse, Aria. This is kidnapping and racketeering. These clinics are off the books holding cells." "He told me today he wants me back at the gym on Monday," I said, looking down at my stomach. I was 12 weeks now. My bump wasn't visible yet, but I could feel the slight change in the way my clothes sat. I can't keep this slender act up much longer, Silas. The baby is growing. Silas walked over and placed a hand over mine, his touch warm and grounding. Then we move faster. I'll start cross-referencing these names with missing persons reports. We're going to build a cage for him, Aria. One he can't buy his way out of. He guided me to the exam table and performed a quick, silent ultrasound. The rhythmic thump-thump of the baby's heart filled the small room, a defiant sound against the silence of the penthouse. "She's strong," Silas whispered, looking at the screen with a look of such tenderness it made my heart ache. "Just like her mother." "I'm scared, Silas," I admitted, looking up at him. "He's starting to talk about a retreat in Vermont for the winter. I think he wants to move me there before I can cause any more scenes." "He won't take you anywhere," Silas said, his eyes locking onto mine with a fierce intensity. "I'm not just your doctor anymore, Aria. I'm your witness. And I promise you, by the time that baby is born, the only one in a locked room will be Preston Montgomery." By the 4th month, my life had become a choreographed dance of shadows and silk. The fashion industry's sudden obsession with oversized chic was my only saving grace. I draped myself in structured capes, heavy cashmere ponchos, and boxy blazers, claiming I was still sensitive about my midsection after the surgery. To the world, I was a style icon reinventing herself. To Preston, I was a project that was failing to meet its deadline. "This is unacceptable, Aria," Preston said one morning. He didn't even say hello. He simply walked into my dressing room while I was trying to hook a pair of vintage slacks that refused to close. I threw a silk robe over myself, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. "Preston, I'm dressing," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "You're hiding," he countered, stepping closer. He looked at the discarded clothes on the floor with a sneer. "You haven't worn a form-fitting dress in weeks. You're becoming soft. I can see it in your face, in the way you move. If you've developed an eating disorder to cope with a miscarriage, I need to know so I can fix it." "I don't have an eating disorder," I said, the irony stinging my throat. "I'm just recovering. My body went through a trauma." "Your body is a representation of my status," he snapped, grabbing my arm. His grip was cold, a reminder of the man who had let me waste away in the dark. "I've made the arrangements. We're leaving for the Vermont retreat in 10 days. It's a private facility, no cameras, no socialites, just a dedicated staff to get you back to your true self. You'll stay there until the spring." 10 days. I whispered. My stomach dropped. I was nearly 20 weeks. In 10 days, I wouldn't be able to hide the life inside me in a clinical setting. "Don't argue," he said, checking his reflection in the gilded mirror. "It's for your own good. I won't have the Montgomery name tarnished by a wife who can't maintain her discipline." The moment he left, I scrambled for my burner phone and messaged Silas. "He's moving the timeline. 10 days. Vermont." We met 2 hours later in the back of a quiet library in Queens. Silas looked haggard, his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. He didn't greet me with a smile. He greeted me with a file folder thick with tragedy. "I found them, Aria," Silas said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "The women in the ledger. Or what's left of them." "Are they?" I couldn't finish the sentence. "2 of them are in permanent state care, their minds shattered by experimental sedative therapies at those private clinics," Silas said, his jaw tight. "The third, Elena, she died 5 years ago. Complications from malnutrition, the death certificate says. But the clinic was owned by a shell company traced back to Preston's primary holding group." I felt the blood drain from my face. "He didn't just lock them away. He erased them. He uses the retreats to break them," Silas said, reaching across the table to take my shaking hands. "When they stop being perfect trophies, he turns them into ghosts."
"But he's not going to do that to you."
"I've been talking to the district attorney's office. We have enough for a preliminary investigation, but to get a conviction that sticks, to make sure he never sees the light of day, we need his own admission of the clinics and his intent." "The anniversary gala," I said, a cold clarity settling over me. "It's in 8 days. It's his biggest night. He'll be arrogant, boastful. He thinks I'm defeated. It's dangerous, Aria, Silas warned, his grip on my hands tightening. If he suspects for a second that you're still pregnant, he won't wait for Vermont. He'll take you that night. I have to do it, I said, looking him in the eye. For Elena, for the others, and for my daughter. I'm not going back into the basement, Silas. Not in this life. Silas looked at me for a long beat, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and profound admiration. Then we make it the performance of a lifetime. I'll be there, Aria. I'll be in the wings the entire time. I won't let the curtain fall on you. The Montgomery Anniversary Gala was the crown jewel of the social season, a gilded masquerade held in the grand ballroom of the Pierre. To the 500 guests sipping vintage Cristal, it was a celebration of 10 years of perfect marriage. To me, it was a battlefield. I stood before the mirror in our penthouse, my breath coming in shallow, careful hitches. I wore a gown of midnight blue heavy silk, custom designed with a high empire waist and architectural pleats that cascaded over my 5-month bump like a waterfall. It was the only thing standing between me and discovery. Hidden beneath the intricate lace of my bodice, pressed cold against my skin, was a high-sensitivity transmitter Silas had secured from his contacts. The pleating is a bit voluminous, Aria, Preston said, appearing behind me. He looked sharp enough to draw blood in a tuxedo that cost more than a surgeon's yearly salary. He reached out, his hand hovering near my waist, and I felt my heart stop. It hides the lines I've spent so much money maintaining. But I suppose it will do for your final public appearance before Vermont. I wanted to look classic tonight, Preston, I said, my voice steady despite the roar of blood in my ears. A legacy look. A legacy of obedience, he corrected, his eyes meeting mine in the mirror. They were as cold as the diamonds at my throat. The car is waiting. Let's go put on a show. The ballroom was a blur of flashing cameras and clinking crystal. I felt Silas's presence before I saw him. He was standing near the bar, looking out of place in a borrowed tuxedo but radiating a quiet, lethal intensity. Our eyes met for a fraction of a second, a silent "I'm here," before he looked away. Preston spent the first hour basking in the adulation of the city's elite. He held my hand like a trophy, his grip a fraction too tight, a constant reminder of his ownership. Every time someone complimented my glow, I felt him stiffen. He didn't see a glow. He saw a rebellion of the flesh. It's time, I whispered to the air, knowing Silas was listening through the wire. I leaned into Preston's ear. It's getting crowded, Preston. I'm feeling a bit faint. Can we step onto the terrace? I need air. Always a drama, he hissed, but he led me toward the French doors. He wanted me away from the crowd if I was going to be unstable. The terrace was empty, the city lights shimmering below us like a sea of cold fire. The moment the doors shut, the loving husband, mask disintegrated. What is wrong with you tonight? Preston demanded, shoving me toward the stone railing. You've been distracted. You're not smiling enough. You're acting like a victim. Is that all I am to you, Preston? I asked, my voice trembling. Not with fear this time, but with the sheer weight of the trap I was about to spring. An image to be managed? What would you do if I wasn't perfect? If I had actually kept the baby? He laughed, a sharp, jagged sound that cut through the night air. If you had kept it? Aria, don't be absurd. You saw what happened to Elena. You saw the ledger, didn't you? I saw you snooping in my desk. I let you do it because I wanted you to know exactly what happens to women who break the mold. You killed her, I said, my heart hammering. You let her starve. I let her recalibrate, he snapped, stepping into my space, his face inches from mine. Just like I'm going to do to you in Vermont. You think you're special? You're an asset, Aria. And when an asset becomes a liability, when it gets soft or pregnant or starts asking questions, it gets sent to the basement for maintenance. I have the doctors on payroll, the clinics under shell companies. No one is coming for you. Are you sure about that? I whispered. Suddenly, the music in the ballroom stopped. In its place, a distorted, booming version of Preston's own voice began to echo from the house speakers. When it gets soft or pregnant, it gets sent to the basement for maintenance. I have the doctors on payroll. Preston's face went from murderous rage to a ghostly, panicked white. He turned toward the glass doors, seeing the sea of socialites staring at him in horrified silence. The perfect man was being unmasked in real time. You bitch, he growled, lunging for my throat. Before he could touch me, the doors flew open. Silas was the first one through, his shoulder hitting Preston with the force of a freight train, pinning him against the stone. Stay away from her, Silas roared. Uniformed officers flooded the terrace, the flash of handcuffs gleaming in the moonlight. As they dragged Preston away, his screams of, "Do you know who I am?" fading into the night, I felt the air finally enter my lungs. I looked at Silas, who was breathing hard, his eyes searching mine for any sign of injury. "Is it over?" I asked, my hand resting finally, openly, on my stomach. "It's over, Aria," Silas said, pulling me into a hug that felt like the first warm thing I'd experienced in 2 lifetimes. "He's never coming back. The house I live in now doesn't have a single marble pillar. There are no floor-to-ceiling mirrors designed for self-scrutiny, and the air doesn't smell like the cold, clinical lilies Preston loved. Instead, it smells of cedar, lavender, and the yeasty, sweet scent of a home that is actually lived in. Our home, a sun-drenched cottage on the edge of a quiet coastal town, is a place where the floorboards creak with history and the garden grows in beautiful, unpruned chaos." The trial had been a whirlwind of headlines and horror. Watching Preston sit in that courtroom, stripped of his bespoke suits and his manufactured prestige, had felt like watching a statue crumble into dust. The testimony of the other women, those Silas and I had tracked down, had been the final hammer blow. He was sentenced to 25 years without the possibility of parole. The masterpiece was finally behind bars, and the image he had spent a lifetime building was officially a stain on the city's history. But the real victory didn't happen in a courtroom. It happened on a rainy Tuesday in February. "Take a deep breath, Aria," Silas said, his voice a steady, grounding anchor in the storm of my labor. He wasn't acting as my doctor today, he was just Silas. He sat on the edge of the hospital bed, his hand gripping mine so tightly I could feel his heartbeat. "You're doing amazing. You are the strongest woman I have ever known." "It's not like the last time," I gasped, the pain of a contraction rolling over me. But it was a productive pain, a life-giving fire rather than the cold, hollow ache of the basement I remembered from that other life. "I'm not afraid, Silas." "You have no reason to be," he said, leaning forward to kiss my sweaty forehead. "I'm right here. I'm never leaving your side." When my daughter was finally placed in my arms, I didn't look at her to see if she was perfect. I didn't check the lines of her face for social symmetry. I just felt the weight of her, solid, warm, and real. She let out a defiant, healthy cry that seemed to echo through the halls, a sound that officially announced the end of the Montgomery shadow. We named her Aria, a name that meant light. Now, 6 months later, I sit on the porch swing, watching the sunset bleed colors across the Atlantic. Aria is asleep in the bassinet beside me, her tiny fists curled against her cheeks. I look down at my own body, the soft curve of my stomach that hasn't quite returned to its socialite dimensions, the faint stretch marks that I once would have viewed as a tragedy. Now they're just maps of where I've been and what I've survived. "She's finally down?" Silas asked, stepping onto the porch. He handed me a mug of tea, the steam curling into the cool evening air. He sat down beside me, the swing creaking gently under our combined weight. "Out like a light," I said, leaning my head on his shoulder. "She had a big day of discovering that grass tickles." Silas laughed, a warm, rich sound that always made my heart swell. A monumental discovery. Much more important than the guest list for the winter gala. "Don't even joke about it," I said, nudging him. "I don't think I could ever go back to that world. I look at photos of myself from 2 years ago, and I don't even recognize that girl. She looks so brittle." "She was a masterpiece in a cage," Silas said, reaching over to tuck a loose strand of hair behind my ear. He looked at me with a gaze that made me feel more beautiful than any designer gown ever had. I prefer the woman who lives in this house. The one who isn't afraid to get her hands dirty in the garden or eat a second slice of cake. I'm happy, Silas, I said, and for the first time in 2 lifetimes, I meant it with every fiber of my being. I'm actually, truly happy. I know, he said, pulling me closer. I can see it in your image. I smiled. The true image wasn't something you could capture in a mirror or a magazine. It was the sight of Silas holding our daughter, the sound of laughter in a kitchen, and the knowledge that I was finally, irrevocably free. I closed my eyes, listening to the waves, and for the first time, I didn't look back. The future was wide open, and it was perfect.